In the 1950s and 1970s, our grandmothers knew how to make lazy suppers that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just skip the stove. They slapped together cold cuts and canned goods that kept them fed when their backs ached. These 30 forgotten lazy suppers might sound too simple today, but they kept seniors alive. Let's rediscover the 30 lazy vintage suppers seniors ate when they were too tired to cook. Cold-cut roll-ups with cream cheese. People still make this today, not because it's fancy. It feels like relief. Cold-cut roll-ups with cream cheese weren't just a snack. They were supper when your back ached and standing at the stove felt impossible. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Spread cream cheese on a slice of deli ham or turkey, roll it tight, slice into rounds, arrange on a plate with crackers. The smell was salty meat and tangy cream cheese. The taste was simple, cold, creamy, satisfying. It cost about 50 cents in 1965, one person, one meal. This worked because cold cuts lasted a week in the icebox, cream cheese kept for days, and crackers never went bad. No cooking required, no heat, no standing, just open, spread, roll, and eat with your hands. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when microwavable frozen dinners started replacing cold suppers. But for seniors who grew up making do, cold-cut roll-ups remained reliable. They were fast, filling, and required nothing but tired hands. But if cold cuts felt too plain, what came next was even simpler, and came straight from a tin. Underwood deviled ham on saltines wasn't fancy. It was supper when you were too exhausted to care. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Pop open a tin of deviled ham, spread it thick on saltine crackers, eat standing at the counter. The smell was salty, porky, and slightly spiced. The taste was rich, spreadable meat with a hint of mustard and spice. It cost about 40 cents in 1955, one tin, 6 crackers, one meal. This worked because deviled ham tins stacked in the pantry for months. Saltines never went stale if you kept the box closed, and you didn't need a plate. No cooking, no knife, no cleanup. Just tin, crackers, done. The meal stayed common through the 1970s when canned meats started feeling old-fashioned. But for seniors living alone, deviled ham remained practical. It was portable, shelf-stable, and tasted like something when you had nothing. But if deviled ham felt too strong, what came next was lighter and came straight from a jar. 3-bean salad wasn't a side dish. It was supper when opening a can was all you could manage. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 2 minutes. Open a can of 3-bean salad, dump it into a bowl, eat it cold with a spoon. The smell was vinegary and sweet. The taste was tangy. Green beans, kidney beans, wax beans soaked in vinegar dressing. It cost about 35 cents in 1965, one can, one bowl, one meal. This worked because 3-bean salad was already dressed, already seasoned, and already cold. No preparation, no chopping, no mixing. Just open, pour, eat. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when fresh salads became more available in grocery stores. But for seniors too tired to wash lettuce, 3-bean salad remained dependable. It was cold, filling, and tasted like a real meal even though it came from a tin. But if 3-bean salad felt too acidic, what came next was softer and mixed in a bowl. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Tuna salad wasn't a sandwich filling, it was supper when you needed protein without turning on the stove. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Open a can of tuna, drain the oil, dump it in a bowl, add a spoonful of mayo, Mix with a fork, eat with crackers or bread. The smell was oily fish and tangy mayo. The taste was simple: salty tuna, creamy dressing, filling. It cost about 50 cents in 1965. One can of tuna, mayo from the jar, crackers on the side. This worked because canned tuna stacked in the pantry for years, mayo kept in the icebox, and you didn't need a recipe. No heat, no knife skills. Just open, mix, eat. The meal stayed popular through the 1990s when fresh tuna became trendy. But for seniors living alone, canned tuna salad remained practical. It was fast, filling, and tasted like effort even when you had none left. But if tuna felt too fishy, what came next was milder and mixed in a can. Canned chicken and celery mash wasn't a casserole. It was supper when chopping felt like too much work. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Open a can of chicken, drain the liquid, dump it in a bowl, chop one stalk of celery, add a spoonful of mayo, mash with a fork, eat with saltines. The smell was mild chicken and fresh celery. The taste was soft. Shredded chicken, crunchy celery, creamy mayo. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. One can of chicken, one stalk of celery, mayo from the jar. This worked because canned chicken lasted on the shelf, celery kept in the crisper for days, and you didn't need a stove. No cooking, no complicated prep. Just open, chop, mash, eat. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when rotisserie chickens became affordable. But for seniors too tired to roast meat, canned chicken remained reliable. It was soft, mild, and easy to chew. But if canned chicken felt too bland, what came next had more flavor and came on white bread. The first 5 suppers were cold, canned, and required nothing but a can opener: cold cuts, deviled ham, 3-bean salad, tuna salad, and canned chicken. But the next 5 go into spreads and sandwiches. By the mid-1950s, that little red devil on the paper-wrapped tin was a permanent resident in every senior's pantry. This wasn't just a spread, it was a wartime survivor that became a peacetime staple. When a senior was too exhausted to even boil water, they reached for Underwood. You didn't need a bowl, you just mixed a dollop of mayo right in the tin, spread it onto saltines, and called it dinner. At 25 cents a can, it was the cheapest protein money could buy. It worked because it was shelf-stable for years, and that slightly spicy, salty kick was enough to wake up a tired palate. It was a taste of the 1940s carried into the modern kitchen. But if the spice of deviled ham was too much for a quiet night, the next meal was its gentle, creamy opposite. Half cottage cheese and canned pear halves were never just a dessert. In the 1960s, they were a practical supper for seniors who found that the simple act of chewing had become a chore. This was the no-teeth dinner of the mid-century, made in under 3 minutes by those who were simply too tired to stand at a stove. The process was a ritual of convenience. Scoop the cold curds, drain a tin of syrup-soaked pears, and let a single fruit half slide onto the top. It smelled of cold milk and canned sugar, and the taste was a soft, slippery comfort that required 0 effort from a tired jaw. At a cost of 45 cents in 1965, it was a budget-friendly way to get protein without the heat of a kitchen. It worked because it relied on the icebox staples of the era and required no preparation beyond a can opener. By the 1980s, yogurt started to dominate the dairy aisle, but for a generation raised on practicality, this soft pairing remained the ultimate relief. It was easy to swallow and even easier to clean up. However, if this creamy bowl felt a bit too plain for a lonely evening, the next vintage staple offered a bit more substance, and it all happened on a humble slice of white bread. But for a generation raised on practicality, this soft pairing remained the ultimate relief. It was easy to swallow and even easier to clean up. However, if this creamy bowl felt a bit too plain for a lonely evening, the next vintage staple offered a bit more substance, and it all happened on a humble slice of white bread. Pineapple and mayo sandwiches were never a joke. For a senior in the 1960s, they were a cool, sweet relief when the southern heat made the stove feel like an enemy. And this was the ultimate lazy supper for those who craved something different without the exhausting effort of cooking. The preparation was a study in simplicity. Open a tin of syrupy rings, slather mayo on soft white bread, and press them together. It smelled of tropical fruit and tang, and while the taste might seem strange today, that creamy, salty, and sweet combination was exactly what a tired body needed. In 1965, this meal cost 35 cents, relying on pantry staples that never required a flame or any knife skills. It worked because the ingredients were shelf-stable and the process required almost no standing. While fresh fruit became common by the 1980s, many seniors kept this tradition alive because it tasted like home and required zero cleanup. It was fast, filling, and effortless. However, if the sweetness of pineapple felt like too much for a quiet night, the next vintage staple offered a sharper, savory bite, and it came in the form of a log. Summer sausage and cheddar slices weren't appetizers. They were supper when slicing was easier than cooking. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice summer sausage into thick rounds, slice sharp cheddar into blocks, arrange on a plate with crackers, eat with your hands. The smell was smoked meat and aged cheese. The taste was salty, tangy sausage, sharp cheddar, crunchy crackers. It cost about 60 cents in 1965, one stick of summer sausage, one block of cheddar, saltines on the side. This worked because summer sausage lasted for weeks unrefrigerated, cheddar kept in the icebox, and you didn't need a knife. No cooking, no heating, just slice, arrange, eat. The meal stayed popular through the 1990s when deli trays became common. But for seniors living alone, summer sausage and cheddar remained dependable. It was filling, flavorful, and required no cleanup. But if summer sausage felt too heavy, what came next was lighter, and came on white bread. Tomato and mayo on white bread wasn't a side dish. It was supper when tomatoes were ripe and the kitchen was too hot to cook. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice a tomato thick, spread mayo on white bread, layer tomato slices on one slice. Sprinkle with salt and pepper, top with the other slice, eat standing at the sink. The smell was fresh tomato and tangy mayo. The taste was summer, juicy tomato, creamy mayo, soft bread. It cost about 25 cents in 1965, one tomato from the garden, mayo from the jar, white bread from the bag. This worked because tomatoes grew in the backyard, mayo kept in the icebox, and you didn't need to turn on the stove. No heat, no cooking, just slice, spread, eat. The meal stayed regional through the 1990s when year-round tomatoes became common. But for seniors living alone, tomato and mayo sandwiches remained seasonal. They were fresh, simple, and tasted like July. But if tomato sandwiches felt too plain, what came next was sweeter, and came in a bowl. The first 10 suppers were cold and fast: roll-ups, deviled ham, tuna salad, pimento cheese, cottage cheese, pineapple sandwiches, summer sausage, and tomato mayo. But the next 10 go into salads and plates: ambrosia salad, cold meatloaf sandwiches, sardines, or Waldorf salad, and the kitchen sink cold plate. Ambrosia salad wasn't dessert. It was supper when you needed something sweet and filling without turning on the oven. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open a can of mandarin oranges, drain the syrup, open a can of pineapple chunks, drain the juice, dump both into a bowl, add a handful of mini marshmallows, fold in a spoonful of sour cream or whipped topping, stir gently, chill in the icebox for an hour if you had time, or eat it immediately if you didn't. The smell was citrus and cream. The taste was sweet, soft fruit, fluffy marshmallows, tangy sour cream. It cost about 50 cents in 1965. 2 cans of fruit, a bag of marshmallows, sour cream from the carton. This worked because canned fruit stacked in the pantry for months. Marshmallows never went bad, and sour cream kept cold in the icebox. No cooking, no baking, just open, mix, eat. Some seniors added shredded coconut or maraschino cherries if they had them, but plain ambrosia was more common. The meal stayed popular at church potlucks and family gatherings through the 1980s, but for seniors living alone, ambrosia salad was a cold supper that felt like celebration. It was sweet enough to feel like dessert, but filling enough to count as dinner. Children loved it because it tasted like candy. Adults loved it because it required no effort. By the 1990s, fresh fruit salads replaced canned ambrosia, but during the 1960s and 70s, ambrosia salad was survival dressed up as something special. It was cold, sweet, and easy to eat with a spoon. But if ambrosia felt too sweet, what came next was savory, and came from the icebox. Cold meatloaf sandwiches weren't lunch. They were supper when you were too tired to reheat yesterday's dinner. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice leftover meatloaf thick, spread yellow mustard on white bread, layer the meatloaf on one slice, add a leaf of iceberg lettuce if you had it, top with the other slice, cut in half, eat standing at the counter. The smell was cold beef and tangy mustard. The taste was simple: dense meatloaf, sharp mustard, soft bread. It cost nothing in 1965. The meatloaf was already made, mustard was in the icebox, bread was in the bread box. This worked because meatloaf lasted 3 days cold, mustard never went bad, and you didn't need to heat anything. No stove, no microwave. Just slice, spread, eat. Some seniors added a slice of American cheese or a dab of ketchup, but plain meatloaf and mustard was more common. The meal stayed practical through the 1990s when microwaves made reheating easy, but for seniors who grew up during the Depression, cold meatloaf sandwiches remained reliable. Heating food felt wasteful when it was already cooked. Cold meatloaf was dense, filling, and tasted fine at room temperature. The mustard cut through the richness, and the bread soaked up the meat juices. By the 2000s, cold sandwiches became less common as reheating became automatic, but during the 1960s and 70s, cold meatloaf sandwiches were a practical way to use leftovers without creating more dishes or turning on the stove. It was survival made efficient. But if cold meatloaf felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and came from a tin. Sardines and crackers weren't a snack. They were supper when you needed protein and had no energy to cook. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Pop open a tin of sardines, drain the oil, arrange the fish on saltine crackers, sprinkle with a few drops of vinegar, eat with your hands. The smell was oily fish and sharp vinegar. The taste was intense. Salty sardines, crunchy crackers, acidic vinegar cutting through the richness. It cost about 40 cents in 1965, 1 tin of sardines. This worked because sardines stacked on the shelf for years, crackers never went stale if you kept the box closed, and vinegar lasted forever. No cooking, no preparation. Just open, drizzle, eat. Some seniors ate sardines straight from the tin with a fork, but crackers made it feel more like a meal. The meal stayed common through the 1980s in coastal regions and among older immigrants, but for most Americans, sardines became less popular as canned tuna took over. Sardines had a strong smell, visible bones, and a fishy taste that younger generations avoided. But for seniors who grew up eating fish heads and organ meats, sardines were mild and convenient. By the 1990s, sardines were considered old-fashioned or ethnic. But during the 1960s and 70s, sardines and crackers were a practical cold supper that delivered protein, omega-3s, and satisfaction without requiring a stove. The vinegar was optional but traditional. It brightened the flavor and made the oily fish easier to digest. But if sardines felt too fishy, what came next was sweeter and came in a bowl. Waldorf salad wasn't a side dish. It was supper when chopping apples and celery was all you could manage. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dice 2 apples into small cubes, chop 2 stalks of celery thin, toss both in a bowl, add a handful of raisins if you had them, fold in a few spoonfuls of mayonnaise, stir until everything was coated, eat with a spoon or scoop onto lettuce leaves. The smell was fresh apples and tangy mayo. The taste was crunchy. Sweet apples, crisp celery, creamy dressing. It cost about 50 cents in 1955, 2 apples from the bin, celery from the crisper, mayo from the jar. This worked because apples and celery kept for days in the icebox. Mayo never went bad, and you didn't need to cook. No heat, no complicated prep. Just chop, mix, eat. Some families added chopped walnuts or grapes, but plain Waldorf salad was more common. The meal stayed popular at ladies' luncheons and church suppers through the 1970s, but for seniors living alone, Waldorf salad was a cold supper that felt elegant. It was sweet enough to feel special, but healthy enough to count as dinner. The celery added crunch, the apples added sweetness, and the mayo tied it all together. By the 1980s, fresh green salads replaced mayo-based salads, but during the 1950s and 60s, Waldorf salad was a practical cold supper that required no stove and delivered nutrition without effort. It was cold, crunchy, and easy to eat when you were too tired to stand at the stove. But if Waldorf salad felt too sweet, what came next was saltier and came on a plate. The kitchen sink, cold plate wasn't a recipe. It was supper when opening the icebox and grabbing whatever was there was all you could do. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice cheddar cheese into blocks, slice salami into rounds, pull dill pickles from the jar, arrange everything on a plate, add a handful of crackers, eat with your hands. The smell was salty cheese, smoky salami, and sour pickles. The taste was varied: sharp cheddar, spiced salami, tangy pickles, crunchy crackers. It cost about 60 cents in 1965, cheese from the block, salami from the deli, pickles from the jar, crackers from the box. This worked because cheese lasted a week in the icebox, salami kept for days, pickles lasted forever in the brine, and crackers never went stale. No cooking, no planning, just slice, arrange, eat. Some seniors added hard-boiled eggs, cherry tomatoes, or olives if they had them, but cheese, salami, and pickles were the basics. The meal stayed common through the 1990s in deli culture regions like New York and the Midwest, but for most seniors living alone, the cold plate was a practical way to eat protein, fat, and vegetables without turning on the stove. It felt like a picnic. It felt like summer. It felt like relief. By the 2000s, charcuterie boards made cold plates trendy again, but during the 1960s and 70s, the kitchen sink cold plate was survival made simple. It was salty, filling, and required no cleanup beyond rinsing a plate. But if the cold plate felt too salty, what came next was sweeter, and came from a jar. The first 15 suppers were cold and required no stove: roll-ups, deviled ham, tuna salad, ambrosia, cold meatloaf sandwiches, sardines, Waldorf salad, and the kitchen sink cold plate. But the next 5 go deeper: pickled beets, mandarin orange fluff, liverwurst sandwiches, cold asparagus, and 7-layer pea salad. Pickled beet and onion salad wasn't a condiment. It was supper when opening a jar was easier than cooking. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Open a jar of pickled beets, drain the vinegar, dump the beets into a bowl, slice a raw onion thin, toss with the beets, eat with a fork. The smell was vinegar and raw onion. The taste was sharp: sweet beets, tangy vinegar, pungent onion. It cost about 40 cents in 1965. 1 jar of pickled beets, 1 onion from the bin. This worked because pickled beets lasted for months in the pantry, onions kept for weeks in the crisper. And you didn't need a recipe: no cooking, no boiling, just open, slice, eat. Some seniors added a spoonful of sour cream or a drizzle of oil to mellow the vinegar, but plain pickled beets and onion was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in Pennsylvania Dutch and Eastern European communities, but for most Americans, pickled beets became less popular as fresh vegetables became more affordable. Pickled beets stained your fingers pink, smelled like vinegar, and tasted too sharp for younger palates. But for seniors who grew up canning and pickling, pickled beets were practical and familiar. By the 1990s, pickled beets were considered old-fashioned, but during the 1960s and 70s, pickled beet and onion salad was a cold supper that delivered vegetables, acidity, and satisfaction without requiring a stove. It was tangy, filling, and easy to eat when you were too tired to chop fresh vegetables. But if pickled beets felt too sharp, what came next was sweeter, and came in a bowl. Mandarin orange fluff wasn't dessert. It was supper when you needed something sweet and cold without turning on the oven. Seniors in the 1970s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Open a can of mandarin oranges, drain the syrup, dump the oranges into a bowl, add a spoonful of whipped topping, fold gently, eat with a spoon. The smell was citrus and cream. The taste was light: sweet oranges, fluffy topping, cold and refreshing. It cost about 40 cents in 1975. 1 can of mandarin oranges, whipped topping from the tub. This worked because canned oranges stacked in the pantry for months. Whipped topping lasted weeks in the freezer. And you didn't need to cook. No baking, no mixing, just open, fold, eat. Some seniors added mini marshmallows or shredded coconut to make it feel more substantial, but plain mandarin orange fluff was more common. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s at church potlucks and ladies' luncheons, but for seniors living alone, mandarin orange fluff was a cold supper that felt like celebration. It was sweet enough to feel like dessert, but light enough to eat when your appetite was small. The oranges were soft and easy to chew, and the whipped topping made it feel indulgent. By the 1990s, fresh fruit salads replaced canned fluff, but during the 1970s, mandarin orange fluff was a practical cold supper that delivered vitamin C and sweetness without effort. It was cold, creamy, and easy to swallow when you were too tired to chew. But if mandarin oranges felt too light, what came next was heavier, and came on rye bread. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches weren't lunch. They were supper when you needed iron and fat and had no energy to cook. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice liverwurst, thick from the chub, spread it on rye bread, layer thin slices of raw onion on top, add a smear of mustard if you wanted it, top with the other slice, cut in half. Eat. The smell was liver and onion. The taste was intense. Rich liverwurst, sharp onion, dense rye bread. It cost about 50 cents in 1965, one chub of liverwurst from the deli, one onion from the bin, rye bread from the bakery. This worked because liverwurst lasted a week in the icebox. Onions kept for weeks, and rye bread stayed fresh for days. No cooking, no heating, just slice, layer, eat. Some seniors added a slice of Swiss cheese or a dab of horseradish, but plain liverwurst and onion was more common. The meals stayed regional through the 1980s in German and Jewish communities, but for most Americans, liverwurst became less popular as leaner deli meats took over. Liverwurst was soft, spreadable, and tasted like organ meat, which it was. Younger generations avoided it, but for seniors who grew up eating liver and kidneys, liverwurst was mild and practical. By the 1990s, liverwurst was considered old-fashioned or ethnic, but during the 1960s and 70s, liverwurst and onion sandwiches were a practical cold supper that delivered protein, iron, and fat without requiring a stove. The onion cut through the richness, and the rye bread soaked up the oils. But if liverwurst felt too strong, what came next was milder and came from a can. Cold canned asparagus with mayo wasn't a side dish. It was supper when vegetables felt necessary, but cooking them felt impossible. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Open a can of asparagus spears, drain the liquid, arrange the spears on a plate. Drizzle with mayonnaise, sprinkle with salt and pepper, eat with a fork. The smell was metallic asparagus and tangy mayo. The taste was soft. Mushy asparagus, creamy mayo, salty seasoning. It cost about 35 cents in 1965, one can of asparagus, mayo from the jar. This worked because canned asparagus stacked in the pantry for years, mayo kept cold in the icebox, and you didn't need to boil water. No cooking, no steaming, just open, drizzle, eat. Some seniors added a squeeze of lemon juice or a sprinkle of paprika, but plain asparagus and mayo was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in the Midwest and South, but for most Americans, canned asparagus became less popular as fresh vegetables became more affordable. Canned asparagus was soft, limp, and tasted like the can. Younger generations preferred crisp, roasted asparagus. But for seniors who grew up during the Depression, canned asparagus was practical and familiar. By the 1990s, canned asparagus was considered outdated. But during the 1960s and 70s, cold canned asparagus with mayo was a practical cold supper that delivered vegetables without effort. It was soft, easy to chew, and required no cleanup beyond rinsing a plate. The mayo made it feel like a real dish instead of just opening a can. But if canned asparagus felt too mushy, what came next was crunchier and came from a bowl. 7-layer pea salad wasn't a salad. It was supper when you made it the night before and had no energy to cook the next day. Seniors in the 1970s made this meal in under 15 minutes the day before. Layer iceberg lettuce, torn into pieces in the bottom of a clear glass bowl. Add a layer of frozen peas, thawed but not cooked. Add a layer of diced celery, add a layer of chopped hard-boiled eggs, add a layer of shredded cheddar cheese, add a layer of cooked bacon crumbles, spread mayonnaise over the top to seal it, cover with plastic wrap, refrigerate overnight. The smell the next day was mayo and bacon. The taste was layered. Crunchy lettuce, sweet peas, salty bacon, creamy mayo. It cost about $1 in 1975. Lettuce from the produce bin, frozen peas from the freezer, eggs from the carton, cheese from the block, bacon from the package, mayo from the jar. This worked because the salad kept cold in the icebox for 2 days. The mayo sealed the layers and kept them fresh, and you didn't need to cook anything except the bacon. No stove the next day, no prep. Just scoop and eat. The meal stayed popular at church potlucks and family reunions through the 1990s, but for seniors living alone, 7-layer pea salad was a cold supper that lasted for days. It was crunchy, creamy, and filling. The layers made it feel fancy, even though it came from a glass bowl. But if 7-layer salad felt too complicated, what came next was simpler and came from a bowl. Shredded carrot and raisin salad wasn't a side dish. It was supper when chewing raw vegetables was all you could manage and cooking felt impossible. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Peel 2 large carrots, shred them with a box grater into a bowl, add a handful of raisins, fold in 2 spoonfuls of mayonnaise, stir until everything was coated, sprinkle with a pinch of sugar if you wanted it sweeter, eat with a spoon or scoop onto lettuce leaves. The smell was sweet carrots and creamy mayo. The taste was crunchy, raw carrots with a slight bitterness, chewy raisins adding sweetness, tangy mayo tying it all together. It cost about 30 cents in 1955. 2 carrots from the bin, raisins from the box, mayo from the jar. This worked because carrots kept for weeks in the crisper. Raisins lasted for months in the pantry, and mayo never went bad in the icebox. No cooking, no boiling, no steaming. Just peel, shred, mix, eat. Some families added chopped walnuts or a squeeze of lemon juice to brighten the flavor, but plain carrot and raisin salad was more common. The meal stayed popular at church potlucks and ladies' luncheons through the 1970s, where it was served in glass bowls on beds of iceberg lettuce. But for seniors living alone, shredded carrot and raisin salad was a cold supper that felt nutritious. It was crunchy enough to feel satisfying, sweet enough to feel like a treat, and cold enough to eat on hot summer nights when turning on the stove felt unbearable. The carrots provided vitamins, the raisins provided energy, and the mayo provided fat. What came next was stranger and came on white bread. Peanut butter and onion sandwiches weren't a mistake. They were supper when protein and sharpness were all you wanted, and cooking felt like too much effort. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Spread peanut butter thick on white bread, slice a raw onion thin, layer the onion slices on top of the peanut butter, top with the other slice of bread, cut in half, eat standing at the counter. The smell was nutty peanut butter and sharp raw onion. The taste was strange, creamy peanut butter, pungent onion, soft bread. The combination shouldn't have worked, but it did. It cost about 20 cents in 1965. Peanut butter from the jar, 1 onion from the bin, white bread from the bag. This worked because peanut butter lasted for months in the pantry, onions kept for weeks in the crisper, and bread never went stale if you kept it wrapped. No cooking, no heating, no toasting. Just spread, slice, layer, eat. Some seniors added a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of salt to balance the flavors, but plain peanut butter and onion was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in rural areas and working-class communities, especially in the Midwest and Appalachia. But for most Americans, peanut butter and onion sandwiches were considered strange or poverty food. Peanut butter belonged with jelly, not onions. But for seniors living alone, peanut butter and onion sandwiches made sense. Peanut butter provided protein and fat, onions provided sharpness and crunch, and bread provided bulk. It was a complete meal that required no stove and cost almost nothing. The texture was interesting. Creamy peanut butter coated your mouth, raw onion scraped your teeth, and soft bread absorbed the juices. The flavor was layered. First you tasted peanut butter, sweet and nutty, then the onion hit, sharp, pungent, almost spicy. By the 1990s, peanut butter and onion sandwiches had mostly disappeared from American tables, remembered only by older generations who grew up eating them during hard times. But for the seniors who ate them regularly, peanut butter and onion sandwiches were neither desperate nor unpleasant. They were simply practical. They were protein, fat, and vegetables on bread, eaten cold because cooking felt like too much work. But if peanut butter and onion felt too strange, what came next was fancier and came from a can. Canned shrimp cocktail wasn't fancy. It was supper when you wanted something special without leaving the house or turning on the stove. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Open a can of tiny shrimp, drain the liquid, dump the shrimp into a small bowl, spoon cocktail sauce from the jar on top, arrange Ritz crackers on a plate, eat with a fork, or scoop the shrimp onto crackers with your hands. The smell was briny shrimp and tangy cocktail sauce. The taste was cold, salty shrimp, spicy sweet sauce, buttery crackers. It cost about 75 cents in 1965. 1 can of tiny shrimp, cocktail sauce from the jar, Ritz crackers from the box. This worked because canned shrimp stacked in the pantry for years. Tea cocktail sauce kept in the icebox once opened, and Ritz crackers never went stale if you kept the sleeve sealed. No cooking, no boiling, no peeling. Just open, drain, sauce, eat. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s at holiday parties, where it was served in fancy glass bowls with lettuce garnish. But for seniors living alone, canned shrimp cocktail was a cold supper that felt celebratory, even when eaten standing at the kitchen counter. The shrimp were tiny, already cooked, peeled, and deveined. They had a rubbery texture and a mild, briny flavor. By the 1990s, fresh shrimp became more affordable, and canned shrimp started to feel outdated. But during the 1960s and 70s, canned shrimp cocktail was a practical cold supper that delivered protein without requiring a stove. It was fast, filling, and tasted like something fancier than it was. But if canned shrimp felt too fancy, what came next was simpler and came in a roll. Ham and pickle roll-ups weren't sushi. They were supper when rolling something tight and eating it with your hands was easier than using a fork. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Lay a slice of deli ham flat on the counter. Spread a thin layer of cream cheese across the surface. Place a dill pickle spear at one end. Roll the ham tightly around the pickle. Slice into rounds. Arrange on a plate. Eat with your fingers. The smell was salty ham and sour pickles. Taste was layered. Smoky ham, tangy cream cheese, crunchy pickle. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. Deli ham from the package, cream cheese from the block, pickles from the jar. This worked because deli ham lasted a week in the icebox, cream cheese kept for days, and pickles lasted forever in the brine. No cooking, no heating, just spread, roll, slice, eat. Children loved them because they looked like pinwheels and tasted like party food. The meal stayed popular at holiday parties and ladies' luncheons through the 1990s, where it was served on fancy platters with toothpicks. But for seniors living alone, ham and pickle roll-ups were a cold supper that felt fun. They were portable, finger food, and required no cleanup beyond wiping cream cheese from your fingers. When you bit into a roll-up, the pickle juice squirted into your mouth, cutting through the richness of the ham and cream cheese. Some people called them Midwest sushi as a joke, because they were rolled like sushi, but contained no rice or fish, just ham, cream cheese, and pickles. But for seniors who grew up during the Depression, ham and pickle roll-ups were simply practical. They were supper when you were too tired to cook. But if ham and pickle roll-ups felt too salty, what came next was lighter and came in a bowl. Cucumber and vinegar soak wasn't a side dish. It was supper when you needed something cold and crunchy and had no energy to cook. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Peel and slice cucumbers thin, layer them in a bowl, sprinkle with salt, pour white vinegar over the top until the cucumbers were covered, let them soak for 10 minutes if you had time, or eat them immediately if you didn't. Serve with thick slices of buttered bread on the side. The smell was sharp vinegar and fresh cucumber. The taste was crisp, cold cucumbers, acidic vinegar, salty seasoning, buttery bread to soften the sharpness. It cost about 30 cents in 1965, 2 cucumbers from the garden or produce bin, vinegar from the pantry, bread from the bag, butter from the icebox. This worked because cucumbers grew in the backyard during summer. Vinegar lasted forever, and bread and butter were always on hand. No cooking, no boiling, no complicated prep. Just slice, soak, eat. Some seniors added a spoonful of sugar to the vinegar to make it sweet and sour, or sprinkled black pepper on top for extra flavor. Plain cucumber and vinegar was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in the South and Midwest, then especially in rural areas where cucumbers were plentiful during summer months. But for most Americans, cucumber and vinegar soak was considered poverty food or farm food, something you ate when you had nothing else. Younger generations preferred fresh salads with lettuce and tomatoes, or cucumber salads with creamy dressing. But for seniors living alone, cucumber and vinegar soak was a cold supper that felt refreshing. It was crunchy enough to feel satisfying, tangy enough to wake up your taste buds, and cold enough to eat on hot summer nights when turning on the stove felt unbearable. The texture was important. The cucumbers had to be sliced thin enough to absorb the vinegar, but thick enough to stay crunchy. The salt drew out moisture from the cucumbers, making them softer and more flavorful. The vinegar provided acidity that cut through the mildness of the cucumbers and made them taste bright and alive. The bread and butter were essential. They soaked up the vinegar and provided richness that balanced the sharpness of the soak. Some seniors dunked the bread directly into the vinegar, turning it into a tangy, cucumber-flavored mush that they ate with a spoon. By the 1990s, cucumber and vinegar soak had mostly disappeared from American tables, replaced by prepackaged salads and bottled dressings. Younger generations found it too simple, too sharp, or too old-fashioned. But during the 1960s and 70s, cucumber and vinegar soak was a practical cold supper that turned garden vegetables into something edible without requiring heat. It was a dish born from summer gardens and Depression-era practicality, eaten cold because cooking felt like too much work. Watergate salad wasn't named after a scandal. It was supper when you needed something sweet and cold and had no energy to cook. Seniors in the 1970s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open a box of instant pistachio pudding mix, dump it into a bowl, open a can of crushed pineapple, dump it in with the juice, add a container of whipped topping, fold everything together until it turned pale green and fluffy. Chill in the icebox for an hour if you had time, or eat it immediately if you didn't. The smell was artificial pistachio and sweet pineapple. The taste was strange. Sweet pudding, tropical fruit, fluffy topping. It was cold, creamy, and unnaturally green. It cost about 75 cents in 1975. 1 box of pistachio pudding, 1 can of crushed pineapple, 1 tub of whipped topping. This worked because instant pudding lasted for months in the pantry, canned pineapple stacked on the shelf, and whipped topping kept in the freezer. No cooking, no baking, no mixing with a beater. Just dump, fold, eat. Some families added mini marshmallows, chopped pecans, or maraschino cherries to make it feel more substantial. But plain Watergate salad was more common. Meals stayed wildly popular at church potlucks, holiday dinners, and family gatherings through the 1990s, where it was served in glass bowls and called salad, even though it tasted like dessert. Nobody knew why it was called Watergate salad. Some said it was invented during the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s. Others said it was originally called Pistachio Delight, but got renamed for marketing reasons. But for seniors living alone, Watergate salad was a cold supper that felt celebratory. It was sweet enough to feel like dessert, but light enough to eat when your appetite was small. The texture was fluffy. By the 2000s, Watergate salad had become a nostalgic joke, a symbol of 1970s convenience cooking and artificial flavors. Younger generations laughed at the bright green color and the concept of calling pudding a salad. But during the 1970s and 80s, Watergate salad was a practical cold supper that delivered sweetness, calories, and satisfaction without requiring a stove. It was especially popular among seniors who had small appetites or difficulty chewing. The texture was soft and smooth, easy to swallow, and required no teeth. Some seniors ate Watergate salad for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, treating it as a meal replacement rather than a dessert. Others made large batches and kept them in the icebox for days, eating spoonfuls whenever they felt hungry. The salad didn't spoil quickly because the pudding mix and whipped topping were both stabilized with preservatives. It was cold, sweet, and filling. But if Watergate salad felt too sweet, what came next was savory and came in a roll. Cold roast beef and horseradish roll-ups weren't lunch. They were supper when you needed protein and had no energy to reheat leftovers. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Slice leftover roast beef thin, spread a thin layer of horseradish sauce across each slice, roll the beef tightly, secure with a toothpick if you had them, arrange on a plate, eat with your fingers. The smell was cold beef and sharp horseradish. The taste was intense, rich roast beef, spicy horseradish burning your sinuses, cold and satisfying. It cost nothing in 1965. The roast beef was already cooked. Horseradish sauce was in the icebox, and you didn't need anything else. This worked because roast beef lasted 3 days cold, horseradish sauce kept for months once opened, and you didn't need to heat anything. The meal stayed practical through the 1990s in households that still made large roasts on Sundays. But for most Americans, roast beef became less common as smaller cuts of meat and quicker cooking methods took over. By the 2000s, few people made roasts large enough to have leftovers, and cold roast beef roll-ups became a forgotten relic of an era when families cooked one large meal and ate leftovers for days. But during the 1960s and 70s, cold roast beef and horseradish roll-ups were a practical cold supper that turned Sunday's roast into Monday's dinner without requiring a stove. The texture was important. The roast beef had to be sliced thin enough to roll, but thick enough to hold its shape. If the beef was too thick, the roll-up fell apart. If it was too thin, it tore when you rolled it. The horseradish provided heat. Not chili pepper heat, but sinus-clearing, nostril-burning heat that made your eyes water and cleared your head. Some people loved the intensity, others found it too strong and used less horseradish, or mixed it with sour cream to mellow the burn. The meal was especially popular among men who lived alone, or widowers who inherited their wives' cooking routines. Cold bread and milk wasn't a snack. It was supper when you were too tired to chew and needed something soft that went down easy. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Tear white bread into pieces, drop them into a bowl, pour cold milk over the top until the bread was covered, sprinkle with sugar, eat with a spoon. The smell was milk and yeast. The taste was simple: sweet milk, soft bread, cold and comforting. It cost about 15 cents in 1965, white bread from the bag, milk from the carton, sugar from the bowl. This worked because bread and milk were always on hand, sugar lasted forever, and you didn't need to cook. No heating, no toasting, no preparation beyond tearing and pouring. Just bread, milk, sugar, done. Some seniors added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra flavor. flavor, but plain bread and milk was more common. Children ate it for breakfast. Seniors ate it for supper when they were too exhausted to stand at the stove. The meal stayed common through the 1980s in rural areas and immigrant communities, especially among Eastern European and Scandinavian families who grew up eating bread soups and milk porridges. But for most Americans, cold bread and milk was considered poverty food or invalid food, something you fed to sick children or elderly relatives who couldn't chew solid food. Milk was considered poverty food or invalid food, something you fed to sick children or elderly relatives who couldn't chew solid food. Younger generations preferred cereal with milk, which felt more modern, and came in colorful boxes with mascots and prizes. But for seniors living alone, cold bread and milk was a practical cold supper that required no effort and went down easy when your appetite was small. The texture was soft and mushy. The bread absorbed the milk and turned into a soggy, porridge-like consistency that you ate with a spoon. Some people found it comforting, others found it unappetizing. But for seniors with dentures, missing teeth, or difficulty swallowing, cold bread and milk was one of the few meals they could eat without pain. The milk softened the bread completely, eliminating the need to chew. The sugar added sweetness that made it feel less like poverty and more like dessert. The meal had deep historical roots. Bread and milk had been eaten for centuries in Europe as a peasant food, a sick-bed meal, or a late-night snack. Immigrants brought the tradition to America, and it survived through the Depression and into the post-war era because it was cheap, filling, and required no cooking. Some families called it milksop or bread soup. Others had no name for it. It was just what you ate when you were too tired or too poor to eat anything else. By the 1990s, cold bread and milk had mostly disappeared from American tables, replaced by instant oatmeal, yogurt, and microwavable meals. Younger generations found the idea strange or even disgusting. Soggy bread in cold milk sounded like something you'd feed to a dog, not a person. But during the 1960s and 70s, cold bread and milk was a practical cold supper that delivered carbohydrates, protein, and comfort without requiring a stove. It was the last meal of the day for seniors too tired to cook, too tired to chew, and too tired to care about anything except getting something soft and sweet into their stomachs before bed. Pear and shredded cheddar salad wasn't dessert. It was supper when you needed something sweet and filling without turning on the stove. And seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 5 minutes. Open a can of pear halves, drain the syrup, place 1 or 2 pear halves on a plate, sprinkle shredded sharp cheddar cheese on top, add a dollop of mayonnaise if you wanted it, eat with a fork. The smell was sweet pears and tangy cheddar. The taste was strange. Soft, syrupy pears, sharp cheese, creamy mayo. It cost about 40 cents in 1955, 1 can of pears, cheddar from the block, mayo from the jar. This worked because canned pears stacked in the pantry for years, cheddar kept in the icebox for weeks, and mayo never went bad. No cooking, no chopping, just open, drain, sprinkle, eat. Some families added a leaf of iceberg lettuce underneath to make it look like a real salad, but plain pear and cheddar was more common. The meal stayed popular at ladies' luncheons and dinner parties through the 1960s, where it was called a salad course and served on fancy plates with a maraschino cherry on top. But for seniors living alone, pear and cheddar salad was a cold supper that felt elegant. The sweetness of the pears balanced the sharpness of the cheddar, and the mayo tied it all together. By the 1970s, fresh fruit salads replaced canned fruit combinations, and pear and cheddar salad disappeared from most tables. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical cold supper that felt special without requiring effort. But if pear and cheddar felt too strange, What came next was the simplest. Cold Spam and pickle plates weren't a recipe. They were supper when opening a can and slicing meat was all you could do. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 3 minutes. Open a can of Spam, slice it thick, arrange the slices on a plate, pull dill pickles from the jar, add a handful of saltine crackers, eat with your hands. The smell was salty Spam and sour pickles. The taste was simple: cold processed meat, tangy pickles, crunchy crackers. It cost about 50 cents in 1965. 1 can of Spam, pickles from the jar, crackers from the box. This worked because Spam lasted for years on the shelf, pickles lasted forever in the brine, and crackers never went stale if you kept the box closed. No cooking, no heating, no preparation. Just open, slice, eat. Some seniors added a slice of American cheese or a smear of mustard on the Spam, but plain Spam and pickles was more common. The meal stayed common through the 1980s in rural areas and among older generations who grew up eating Spam during World War II. But for most Americans, Spam became less popular as deli meats and fresh protein became more affordable. Younger generations mocked Spam as poverty food or wartime rations. But for seniors living alone, cold Spam and pickles was a practical cold supper that delivered protein without requiring a stove. By the 1990s, Spam had mostly disappeared from American tables except in Hawaii and certain immigrant communities. But during the 1960s and 70s, cold Spam and pickle plates were a practical cold supper, the last resort when you were too tired to do anything except open a can and eat. These 30 lazy suppers that kept seniors fed when their backs ached and the stove felt miles away. These weren't fancy. But what happened when she had 10 minutes, when she could stand at the stove just long enough to heat something fast? They were cheap, quick, and filled the plate.